The clay feels cool through the protective glass. Smooth in places where ancient thumbs pressed characters into wet earth. Rough where time has worn the surface like river stones. 4 sides. Narrow at the top, widening toward the base. A prism, roughly 8 inches tall, covered entirely in wedge-shaped impressions that spiral down its length in neat columns. The lighting in the Ashmolean Museum cast shadows into each cuneiform sign, making them easier to read, transforming simple clay into a message that has survived 40 centuries. This is WB444, the Weld Blundell Prism, and inscribed across its 4 faces is a timeline that doesn't fit the history you learned in school. The text begins simply enough: 5 cities, 8 kings, but then come the numbers. Alulim ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. Al-Aujar ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenlu Ana ruled in Bad Tibira for 40,200 years. The list continues through 8 rulers across 5 ancient cities, each reign measured not in decades or even centuries, but in millennia that stack impossibly high. When you total the years these 8 kings ruled before a great flood swept across the land, you arrive at a number that mainstream archaeology dismisses as obvious mythology: 200 and 400 years. But here's what they don't teach in history class. This wasn't written as mythology. It was written as a king list, a royal chronology, an administrative document that later Mesopotamian scribes treated with the same bureaucratic precision they used to record grain harvests and temple inventories. The same scribes who gave us detailed accounts of bread rations and sheep counts also carefully preserved these impossibly long reigns, copying them from older sources, maintaining the numbers exactly across multiple versions of the text. They didn't question them. They didn't add notes saying, "This is symbolic." They simply recorded what their ancient sources told them. Before the flood, kingship descended from heaven, and those who ruled were not quite human. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. Now, if you're listening to this late at night, maybe you're in bed with the lights off, or perhaps you're driving through empty highways where the darkness stretches between towns. Maybe you're in Sydney or Stockholm, Sao Paulo or Seattle. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, take a moment and leave a comment. Just your city and the time. There's something grounding about knowing we're all scattered across this planet, all looking up at the same moon the Sumerians watched, all wondering about the same questions they wondered about. Were they recording something real? Is there a timeline buried in these tablets that academia prefers not to examine too closely? The prism sits in its climate-controlled case, silent, factual, undeniable. The text is there. The numbers are there, and what they describe is a chronology of rulers who came from the sky, governed cities that existed before civilization supposedly began, and reigned for periods of time that modern scholarship can only explain by saying it must be symbolic. But symbolic of what? And why does this symbolism appear in such specific, consistent detail across multiple independent sources? Why do other tablets, flood accounts, creation stories, administrative records all reference these same beings with the same terminology, the same hierarchies, the same procedural details that read less like myth and more like documentation? This isn't about ancient astronauts building pyramids with laser beams. This isn't about conspiracy theories involving reptilian shapeshifters. This is about what the tablets actually say, in their own words, in their original context, before modern interpretation decided what they must have meant. This is about a timeline that appears again and again in Sumerian records, a chronology that connects pre-flood kings to post-flood dynasties, divine beings to human rulers, a world before catastrophe to a world after it. The academic explanation is simple. Ancient people inflated numbers to give their kings divine legitimacy. The reigns are metaphorical. The Anunnaki are mythological. The whole thing is symbolic poetry that primitive minds couldn't distinguish from history. But that explanation requires us to believe that the Sumerians, who invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, law codes, and urban planning, somehow couldn't tell the difference between a poem and a chronological record. It requires us to ignore the fact that they kept separate categories for myths, hymns, prayers, and administrative documents. It requires us to dismiss the procedural details, the specific numbers, the careful preservation of this timeline across centuries of copying. What if we're reading it wrong? What if dismissing it as mythology is the interpretation error, not accepting it as their recorded history? The prism waits in Oxford, patient as the clay from which it was formed. The text hasn't changed. The numbers haven't shifted. What has changed is our willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about what these ancient record keepers were actually trying to preserve. They had reasons for writing these numbers down. They had sources they were copying from, and they believed, or at least their sources believed, that before the flood there was a time when beings called Anunnaki ruled as kings on Earth, and that time was measured not in human lifespans, but in something longer, something that doesn't fit our comfortable timeline of civilization emerging from crude beginnings. So let's examine what the tablets actually say. Let's trace this Anunnaki timeline through the evidence that survives, through multiple independent sources, through administrative records and creation accounts, and flood narratives that all tell variations of the same story. Let's look at the chronology they don't teach in history class, not because it's been hidden, but because it's easier to call it mythology than to confront the possibility that the Sumerians were recording something real. The prism sits in its case, the wedges press into clay, and the timeline begins not with primitive humans learning to farm, but with kingship descending from heaven to cities that weren't supposed to exist yet. Let the investigation begin. The cities before history began. The archaeologists expected nothing, not at first. When expeditions began excavating tells, those artificial hills that dot the Iraqi landscape like burial mounds for entire cities, they anticipated finding the usual progression, recent Islamic layers on top, older Persian ruins beneath, perhaps some Babylonian architecture if they were lucky. They understood how civilizations worked. Crude villages evolved into towns. Towns grew into cities. Writing emerged gradually from simple counting tokens. Complexity built upon complexity over millennia of slow development. Then they reached the Sumerian levels, and the progression stopped making sense. Eridu sits in southern Iraq, about 12 miles southwest of Ur. When archaeologists excavated Tel Abu Sharain in the 1940s and 1950s, they found something that shouldn't have existed. A massive temple complex at the very bottom layers, the oldest strata, built with architectural sophistication that was supposed to take centuries to develop. Temple after temple, each built directly on top of its predecessor, 18 successive structures stretching back to the Ubaid period around 5000 BCE. But these weren't crude shrines. They had central sanctuaries offering tables, altars positioned precisely, drainage systems, decorated facades. The earliest temple at Eridu was already following principles of sacred architecture that supposedly hadn't been invented yet. The Sumerians themselves said Eridu was the first city, not the first city they built, the first city, period. Before Eridu, their texts insist there was nothing, no cities, no kingship, no civilization. Then, as the king list states with bureaucratic clarity, kingship descended from heaven, and Eridu became the seat of the first rulers. The god Enki, they said, established his temple there when he first came to Earth. The Abzu, the primordial waters, the deep lay beneath Eridu, making it the connection point between heaven, earth, and the cosmic deep. What the archaeologists found suggests the Sumerians weren't exaggerating. The temple tradition at Eridu extends back further than nearly any other site in Mesopotamia. The architecture doesn't show experimental phases. The first temple already knows what a temple should look like. Move northwest to Uruk, biblical Erech, where kingship transferred according to the tablets. Here, the archaeological contradictions intensify. By 4000 BCE, Uruk covered nearly 250 acres, housing perhaps 40,000 people, an urban population density that cities in Europe wouldn't achieve until the medieval period. The Iana Temple district contained buildings constructed with limestone and gypsum, decorated with elaborate cone mosaics that created geometric patterns across entire facades. The labor organization required to quarry, transport, and place millions of baked clay cones into wet plaster suggests administrative sophistication that doesn't fit the time and the writing. The earliest texts appear suddenly at Uruk around 3400 BCE, not as primitive pictures, but as a developed system of several hundred signs already categorized into groups representing objects, actions, and abstract concepts. Yes, it evolved over the next few centuries, but it emerged with structural principles already in place. Modern linguistics calls this Cuneiform's rapid development, but rapid compared to what? We have no evidence of the experimental phase, no archaeological layers showing the slow invention of symbolic representation. The script appears in the late Uruk period, already doing what writing systems do, recording transactions, listing inventories, organizing information in standardized formats. The same pattern repeats at Nippur, the religious center where the king list was copied and recopied by scribes for over 1,000 years. Nippur's Eka temple, the mountain house, was the meeting place of the divine assembly, the location where the Anunnaki gathered to make decisions affecting heaven and earth. Archaeological excavations revealed a temple complex of staggering scale, with construction phases extending back to the early dynastic period and beyond. But here's what's strange. Nippur was never a political capital. It was never the seat of military power. Yet every Mesopotamian king from every dynasty considered control of Nippur essential to legitimacy. Why? Because whoever controlled Nippur controlled access to the Anunnaki's assembly hall, the place where, according to the tablets, the seven who decree fates made their decisions. This wasn't how cities were supposed to develop. Cities form around resources, water, trade routes, defensive positions. They grow gradually. Their institutions evolve, but the Sumerian cities appear with their institutional structures already defined. Eridu exists to house Enki. Nippur exists as the assembly point. Uruk exists as the center of sacred kingship. Each city has a function within a larger system, as if the system came first and the cities were built to serve predetermined roles. The pottery tells the same story. Sumerian pottery from the earliest layers shows wheel-thrown vessels with standardized dimensions, suggesting not individual craftsmen experimenting, but organized workshops, producing goods to specifications. The agriculture shows planned irrigation systems requiring collective labor and centralized authority. The architecture shows knowledge of load-bearing principles, foundation preparation, and spatial organization, all of it present from the beginning, all of it lacking the expected developmental stages. Mainstream archaeology explains this as rapid development during the Uruk period, but that explanation raises its own questions. Rapid development requires knowledge transfer. Where did the knowledge come from? The standard answer points to gradual accumulation, but the archaeological record shows gaps. We find sophisticated results without the trial and error process that creates sophistication. It's like discovering a completed manual without the rough drafts. The Sumerians themselves offered a different explanation, recorded carefully in their king lists, their temple hymns, their creation accounts. They didn't claim to have invented civilization. They claimed to have received it from the Anunnaki, from those who came from the sky, from the ones who, before the flood, ruled as kings in cities that existed before history began. Consider what the tablets describe. Enki coming to Eridu and establishing the Meh, the divine principles governing civilization. These weren't abstract religious concepts. The Mehs included specific practical knowledge, construction, irrigation, metalworking, writing, law, governance, agriculture, measurement. The texts treat them as transferable information, actual knowledge that could be possessed, stolen, given as gifts. When Inanna takes the mess from Enki in the myth, she's not stealing abstractions, she's acquiring the practical knowledge needed to build civilization in Uruk. The archaeological problem is this: the cities appear with that knowledge already implemented. The practical results, irrigation, administration, architecture, writing, are present without the developmental period. Standard chronology says this happened through normal cultural evolution compressed into a few centuries of rapid change. But compressed cultural evolution still requires the stages to occur, just faster. What we find instead is something closer to implementation. The knowledge appears, and the cities reflect that knowledge from their earliest levels. Could the Sumerians have been recording actual events? Not gods in a theological sense, but what they called gods, the Anunnaki, who possessed advanced knowledge and taught it, transferred it, implemented it in cities built according to plans. Could kingship descended from heaven mean exactly what it says? Rulership came from outside, from beings who arrived and established the first cities according to purposes the Sumerians themselves didn't fully understand. The tablets say Eridu was built when Enki arrived, and before humans existed in their current form. They say Nippur was established as the assembly point for the Anunnaki Council before kingship transferred to human rulers. They say Uruk became the center of sacred kingship when divine authority began transitioning from Anunnaki direct rule to human dynasties guided by divine principles. These aren't origin myths explaining natural phenomena. These are institutional histories explaining why each city has its specific function within the system, and the cities themselves, their layouts, their temple orientations, their functional relationships support those histories. Eridu's temple sits at the southernmost point, positioned as a gateway. Nippur sits in the center, equidistant from the major city-states, serving its role as neutral meeting ground. Uruk sits strategically on trade routes, positioned to project power. If someone were designing a civilization from above, planning cities for specific functions within an integrated system, this is what it might look like. The archaeological evidence doesn't prove the Anunnaki were real, but it does present a pattern that mainstream chronology struggles to explain. Sophisticated urban civilization appearing rapidly, with key technologies and institutions already developed, in cities that seem purpose-built for roles described in texts that claim those roles were assigned by beings who came from the sky. Before Eridu, the Sumerians said, there was nothing. After Eridu, there was civilization. The gap between those two states is supposed to contain centuries of gradual development, but the archaeology keeps finding implementation without experimentation, results without process, cities that appeared knowing what they were supposed to be. What if the texts are more accurate than the theories? What if the Sumerian king lists timeline don't begin with human kings inflating their importance, but with actual rulers who came before, established the cities, and governed for periods of time measured in something other than human lifespans? What if before the flood, before whatever catastrophe the tablets consistently describe, there was a different world with different rulers, operating on a different timescale? The cities sit in the desert now, tells covering tells, clay fragments scattered across excavation trenches. But the oldest levels keep presenting the same problem. They're too sophisticated too soon. Unless the Sumerians were telling the truth, unless civilization didn't evolve, unless it was given, unless those who gave it ruled from cities built for purposes we're still trying to understand, during a period of time that stretched longer than our comfortable chronologies allow. The timeline in the tablet says 1,200 years of Anunnaki rule before the flood. The cities themselves, in their earliest forms, already reflect knowledge that was supposed to take millennia to develop. The gap between those two facts is where the questions live. Questions about whether descending from heaven is metaphor or description, whether the Anunnaki were myths or records, whether the cities before history began were built by humans learning to cooperate, or by someone else entirely. The archaeologists keep digging. The tells keep revealing layers. And at the bottom of it all, where civilization first appears, the evidence keeps suggesting the same uncomfortable possibility. The Sumerians remembered something. They recorded something. And what they recorded doesn't match the evolutionary timeline we've built to explain them. When gods walked as kings. The prism's first section reads like a government document. No poetry, no elaborate descriptions, just names, cities and numbers, presented with the same bureaucratic precision a modern accountant would use to list quarterly earnings. The format itself tells you something. This is a record, not a story. Records have different purposes than myths. Records exist to preserve information across time, to maintain continuity, to establish legitimacy through documented succession. The Sumerian king list functions as exactly that. A chronological registry of who ruled, where they ruled, and for how long. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king and ruled for 28,800 years. Alajar ruled for 36,000 years. Two kings ruled for 64,800 years. Then Eridu fell and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira. In Bad Tibira, Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. Enmengal, Anna ruled for 28,800 years. The divine Dumuzi, the shepherd, ruled for 36,000 years. Three kings ruled for 108,000 years. Then Bad Tibira fell, and the kingship was taken to Larag. In Larag, Ensipadzid Anna ruled for 28,800 years. One king ruled for 28,800 years. Then Larag fell, and the kingship was taken to Zimbir. In Zimbir, Enmendur Anna ruled for 21,000 years. One king ruled for 21,000 years. Then Zimbir fell, and the kingship was taken to Shuruppak. In Shuruppak, Ubatutu ruled for 18,600 years. One king ruled for 18,600 years. Total 5 cities. 8 kings. 2,1200 years. Then the flood swept over. After the flood swept over and kingship descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish. The reigns that follow, post-flood dynasties, measure in decades and centuries, not tens of millennia. The transition is abrupt, documented, unexplained. Before the flood, rulers reigned for periods measured in multiples of 3,600 years. After the flood, normal human lifespans. The text acknowledges the break, but offers no explanation for the dramatic shift in how time is measured. Mainstream scholarship explains the pre-flood section as mythological inflation. Ancient kings claimed divine descent to legitimize their rule, so earlier dynasties received progressively more exaggerated reigns, until you arrive at the antediluvian rulers whose impossibly long reigns mark them as purely legendary. The numbers themselves are dismissed as symbolic. 3,600 was a significant number in Sumerian mathematics, being 60 squared, so the pre-flood reigns are merely multiples of this sacred number. The whole section serves as a prologue to establish that kingship is ancient, divine in origin, and transferred through legitimate succession. It's mythic charter, not history. That explanation works until you examine how the text itself behaves. Because here's what's strange: the king list treats pre-flood and post-flood rulers with identical structure and format. Same grammatical construction, same formulaic phrases, same matter-of-fact listing of name, city, and reign. No change in register. No shift from mythic to historical mode. The text doesn't signal that it's transitioning from legend to fact. It presents a single, continuous chronology that happens to pass through a catastrophic flood event, after which the numbers change but the format doesn't. If the pre-flood section is pure mythology, why does it use administrative documentary style rather than epic poetry? Mesopotamian scribes knew how to write myths. The Enuma Elish, the Gilgamesh epic, the Era, and Isham narrative all employ poetic structures, repeated formulae, and dramatic narrative devices. The king list uses none of these. It reads like what it claims to be: a royal chronology, a succession list, a dated record of who ruled when. The numbers themselves present a different problem than symbolic inflation would predict. If the goal was simply to make early kings seem more impressive, why use such specific multiples? Why 28,800 years instead of a very long time, or countless years? why maintain mathematical relationships between the reigns? Alulim's 28,800 years is 8 times 3,600. Enmen Luana's 43,200 years is 12 3,600. Alaljar's 36,000 years is 10 3,600. Every pre-flood reign divides evenly by 3,600. This suggests the numbers mean something specific, not that they're randomly exaggerated for effect. What if 3,600 is not a symbolic unit, but a measurement unit? What if these numbers record something real, but we're misunderstanding what they're measuring? The Sumerian sexagesimal system base, 60 mathematics, allows for precise astronomical calculations. The number 3,600 also appears in astronomical contexts as a great year, a complete cycle. Could the king list be recording reigns not in Earth years as we understand them, but in some other cyclical measurement? This possibility becomes more intriguing when you compare the Sumerian king list to other antediluvian chronologies. The Hebrew Bible lists 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah, each living for centuries rather than millennia, but still far beyond normal human lifespans. The Babylonian priest Berosus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, recorded Mesopotamian tradition that 10 kings ruled before the flood for a total of 432,000 years, exactly 130,000, 30,000, 3,600. Different tradition, different numbers, but the same pattern: long-lived pre-flood rulers, a catastrophic flood, then normal human chronology resuming. The global consistency suggests these cultures were accessing shared memory of actual events, even if the details became distorted through transmission, or all ancient cultures independently invented the same narrative structure, which requires explaining why this particular structure, impossibly long pre-flood rulers followed by a great flood, appears specifically and repeatedly, rather than the infinite variations mythology could produce. The king list itself provides a clue about how seriously the Sumerians took these numbers. Multiple versions of the text survive, copied across centuries, and the pre-flood numbers remain consistent. Scribes copying royal propaganda might be expected to alter details for political advantage, but the antediluvian section stays stable. The Prism was written around 2000 BCE, copying sources that were already ancient. Those sources were considered authoritative enough that their content couldn't be modified. This suggests the numbers came from records that predated even the earliest Sumerian dynasties, records that scribes preserved precisely because they couldn't verify or alter them. What were those earlier sources? The king list itself doesn't say, but other tablets provide context. The instructions of Shuropak wisdom literature attributed to Ubatutu, the last pre-flood king, claim to be advice from father to son. Shuropak says, "My son, let me give you instructions." And what follows is sophisticated ethical teaching about justice, truthfulness, prudent behavior, respect for property and boundaries. This is presented as pre-flood literature, as knowledge preserved from the antediluvian world. Either this is literary fiction attributing later wisdom to ancient kings, or it's accurately labeled instructions that actually survived from before the catastrophe. The flood accounts themselves suggest knowledge preservation was deliberate. In the Eridu Genesis, the god Enki warns Yusudra and tells him to build a boat, but the text also mentions writing, records, and the preservation of civilization's knowledge. In the Atrahasis epic, Atrahasis is described as exceedingly wise and is given specific technical instructions for boat construction with precise measurements. In Gilgamesh tablet X-Ive, Utnapishtim describes writing the account of his journey on a stele, so future generations would know what happened. These aren't oral traditions. They're documented records, texts that survived the catastrophe because someone preserved them intentionally. Could the king list numbers be part of that preserved knowledge? Could some administrative record from the pre-flood world have survived, maintaining its original data, which later Sumerians copied faithfully even though they no longer understood what the numbers measured. That would explain the precision without comprehension. Numbers maintained because they came from ancient authority, even if their meaning had become obscure. The transition at the flood becomes crucial here. The text says, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood swept over and kingship descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish. That phrase, "descended from heaven again," suggests kingship had to be re-established after the catastrophe. Something was interrupted, the continuity broke, but then it resumed following the same pattern. Legitimate rule comes from divine authority, transferred through proper succession. The flood didn't end the system, it disrupted it. And after disruption, the system was restored, but with modified parameters. The long reigns ended. Human scale chronology began. This pattern appears in the archaeological record as well. There's a destruction layer in Mesopotamian sites around 2900 BCE, sometimes called the flood layer, though debate continues about whether this represents a single catastrophic event or multiple local floods conflated in memory. What's undeniable is that civilization reboots after this layer. The early dynastic period begins. Historical kings with archaeologically verified reigns start appearing. The mythology solidifies into the forms we recognize from later tablets. Something changed around this time, something significant enough that later cultures remembered it as the moment when the old world ended and the new one began. If the Anunnaki were real, not as gods, but as whatever the Sumerians actually meant by that term, then the pre-flood section of the king list might record their direct governance period. 8 rulers across 5 cities over a period measured in a time span we don't recognize. Then catastrophe. Then human kingship under divine guidance measured in familiar years. The tablets would be describing a transition from one kind of rule to another, from one kind of ruler to another, marked by a catastrophic event that survivors preserved in multiple traditions. Or the whole thing is mythological charter, numbers inflated to make kingship seem eternal and divinely ordained, a cultural narrative doing what cultural narratives do, creating coherence and meaning from the chaos of historical change. But the format argues against pure myth. The consistency argues against invention. The mathematical precision argues against arbitrary inflation. And the Sumerians themselves never treated it as myth. They treated it as their chronology, their royal succession, their documented history extending back to when kingship first descended from heaven, and the Anunnaki ruled as kings in cities that existed before the world we know. The prism sits in Oxford. The numbers remain unchanged. 8 kings, 5 cities, 2 for 1,200 years. Then the flood. Then human history, as we understand it, begins, emerging from catastrophe, preserving memories of a different time when those who ruled were not like us, who reigned in measures we no longer understand, who walked as kings when gods were simply another word for those who came from the sky. The labor, the rebellion, the solution. The Atrahasis epic begins not with creation but with a problem. The problem is practical, immediate, and described in detail that reads more like a labor dispute than theological mythology. When the gods were man, when gods performed the work, they bore drudgery, they carried the load. The excavation work was heavy. The building work was difficult and the toil was excessive. For 3,000 years they bore the excessive work, laboring day and night. The text specifies what this labor involved. They dug waterways, they excavated canals, they cleared the channels of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they carried earth in baskets, they built embankments, they performed construction work. The work had a purpose: terraforming Mesopotamia, creating the irrigation infrastructure that would eventually support civilization. But the Anunnaki assigned to this labor, specifically identified as the Ijiji, a class of younger or lower ranked Anunnaki, had reached their breaking point. Tablet I describes the rebellion with striking specificity. The Ijiji set fire to their tools, they burned their spades, they set fire to their picks. They marched together to the gate of Enlil's temple, carrying the physical proof of their refusal to continue. This is strike action. This is organized labor protest. The text even describes them rallying to a leader, deliberating about their demands, choosing representatives to state their case before the authority they're refusing to serve. Enlil, described as supervisor of the work, wakes to find armed Igigi surrounding his temple. He alerts An, the supreme authority, and summons Enki to deal with the crisis. The Council of Anunnaki convenes in emergency session. The text records their deliberation. Who is responsible for this action? Who has incited war? Shall we fight them? The labor dispute has escalated to potential civil conflict within the Anunnaki ranks. What happens next is crucial. Enlil proposes crushing the rebellion. An suggests negotiation, but Enki asks the practical question: what are we accusing them of? Their labor was heavy, their burden excessive, their clamor was loud. The text validates the complaint. The work was actually too much. The rebellion had legitimate cause. And, more importantly, the question Enki poses matters for functional reasons. If we punish them, who will do the work? The problem that caused the rebellion remains unsolved. Enki's solution is presented as practical innovation, not mystical creation. He proposes creating Lalu humans as replacement workers. The text says, "Let a primitive worker be created. Let him bear the yoke. Let him bear the yoke assigned by Enlil. Let man carry the drudgery of the gods." The purpose is explicit. Humans are designed as labor substitutes, created to perform the work the Igigi refuse to continue. The creation procedure that follows reads less like divine miracle and more like procedure. Nintu, the birth goddess, is called to assist. Enki describes the process: "They shall slaughter one god in the assembly, from his flesh and blood. Let Nintu mix clay, so that God and man shall be mixed together in clay." The text specifies that the slaughtered god's flesh and blood contribute something specific: his ghost, his personality, his awareness, which gets mixed with clay to create the template for human being. The procedure continues with technical details. Nintu requires 14 birth goddesses to assist. They prepare 14 lumps of clay mixed with the divine component. 7 are designated male, 7 female. The birth goddesses carry them in the wombs, suggesting the mixed clay divine essence requires gestation, biological development within existing biological organisms. After 10 months they give birth. Humans emerge, capable of work, but also possessing something from the divine source: awareness, intelligence, the ghost of the slaughtered god providing consciousness. This is functional biology described in terms available to the text's authors. Whether it's accurate biology is different from whether it's attempting to describe an actual procedure. The text certainly treats it as procedural, listing steps, identifying required participants, specifying timing, describing outcomes. It doesn't say the gods willed humanity into existence through mystical power. It describes mixing components, gestation periods, and birth procedures. The naming of the first human is similarly specific. The text calls him Adamu, from Adama, clay, or earth. The name identifies the source material. Later texts using Akkadian and Hebrew cognates maintain this connection. Adam comes from Adama. Humans are earthlings, clay-based beings mixed with divine essence. The consistency across cultural adaptations suggests the core narrative was considered factual by those transmitting it, not symbolic poetry that could be freely modified. After humans are created and the work transferred, the text describes a transition period. The Anunnaki teach humans what to do. They show them agriculture, construction, irrigation maintenance. The relationship shifts from Anunnaki performing the work to Anunnaki supervising human performance of the work. This matches the pattern described in creation accounts, where the mess civilizational knowledge is transmitted from divine to human realms. Knowledge transfer happens because humans need training in tasks the Anunnaki previously performed themselves. But problems arise. The text describes humans multiplying rapidly. Their noise becomes excessive. Enlil, still supervisor, grows disturbed by the increasing human population and decides to reduce their numbers through plague, famine, and eventually flood. The decision isn't capricious. divine anger. It's population management by an administrator who sees the created workforce exceeding parameters. The relationship is functional, not theological. The rebellion narrative serves specific purposes if read as historical documentation rather than myth. It explains why humans exist, a solution to a labor shortage. It explains why humans possess intelligence and awareness, because divine essence was mixed into the creation formula. It explains why civilization appeared suddenly in Mesopotamia, because Anunnaki, who previously performed the work, taught humans to continue it. And it explains the flood as deliberate culling of human population that had exceeded its intended scale. Could this be mythology explaining human origins? Obviously, every culture has creation stories, but the details matter. Most creation myths don't describe labor disputes among the creators. They don't treat human creation as problem solving. They don't include procedural details about mixing components and gestation periods. They don't frame the creator-created relationship as supervisor workforce rather than worship a deity. The text also reveals something about the Anunnaki themselves. They can be hurt, they can be killed, and they require physical labor unless they have someone else to perform it. These aren't omnipotent theological gods. These are powerful beings with technological capabilities far beyond human, but they're not infinite in power. One is slaughtered to provide the biological component for human creation. Others spent 3,600 years performing hard physical labor. Still others hold administrative authority, but must deal with rebellions and make practical decisions about resource management. The number 3,600 appears again in the labor duration. For 3,600 years, they bore the excessive work. The same number that structures the king list reigns. This suggests 3,600 represents a meaningful time unit in the original chronology, something that measures real duration in ways we no longer understand. Whether it's Earth years, orbital cycles, or some other measurement, the consistency indicates it meant something specific to whoever originally recorded these events. The Barton cylinder, an independent creation account housed as CBS 8383 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes similar procedures from a different angle. Enki and Nintu collaborate to fashion humans, with clay and divine blood mixed together, with specific procedures for determining male and female characteristics. The tablet specifies that 14 birth goddesses participate, and that gestation takes 10 months. Exactly matching the Atrahasis account. Two independent texts describing the same procedure with identical detail. This consistency suggests both texts are drawing from a common source that they're attempting to preserve accurate. The Enki and Ninmah text preserved on tablets CBS 228 and CBS 4561 adds another layer. It describes Enki and Ninmah competing to see who can create viable humans, resulting in several defective versions before they perfect the formula. This detailed trial and error, experimental development, failed attempts before success, reads like research and development, not divine omnipotent creation. It suggests the procedure wasn't automatic, that expertise was required, that outcomes could be unpredictable, which matches how actual biological engineering would function, not how theological creation is typically described. If the Anunnaki were real in some form, not gods, but whatever the Sumerians actually meant by that term, the rebellion narrative might preserve accurate history. A workforce engaged in massive terraforming projects rebelled against excessive labor. The leadership council faced a practical problem. Punishing the rebellion would eliminate the workforce needed to continue the projects. Creating an alternative workforce became necessary. The procedure developed used local biological material, clay, earth, organic compounds, mixed with Anunnaki, genetic or biological essence, to create hybrid workers who could perform physical labor while possessing enough intelligence to learn complex tasks. This interpretation doesn't require believing in ancient astronauts specifically. It simply takes the text at face value as describing events from the perspective of those who witnessed them. If some advanced civilization or non-human intelligence visited Earth in deep antiquity and engaged in large-scale infrastructure projects using subordinate workers who eventually rebelled, and if that civilization then created humans as replacement labor, and if Sumerian texts preserve memory of these events described in terminology available to Bronze Age scribes, then the Atrahasis epic reads as exactly what it claims to be, a historical account of origins. The alternative is that multiple independent texts describing identical procedures with matching details are all sophisticated theology, that the labor dispute framework is purely metaphorical, that the practical problem-solving tone is literary device, and that Sumerians just happen to invent creation mythology that reads like technical documentation rather than like any other creation myth from any other culture. The tablet sits in the British Museum. The text is clear. The procedure is described. The problem and solution are practical. The tone is administrative. And what it documents is a world where beings called Anunnaki performed physical labor, rebelled against that labor, and solved their problem by creating humans to bear the work instead. Whether that documentation reflects theology or history depends on whether we're willing to take seriously the possibility that the Sumerians were recording something real, something they witnessed or inherited knowledge of, something that happened before the flood, in that antediluvian period when the king list says Anunnaki ruled as kings for 200 and 400 years, and cities existed that performed functions we're still trying to understand. The rebellion happened, the text says. The problem was solved, and humanity is that solution, created for purposes we've forgotten, but which the tablets remember. Created not in divine image for spiritual relationship, but in mixed form for practical function. Created to carry the drudgery of gods who needed workers, but whose own workforce refused to continue serving. The clay remembers. The blood remembers. And what they remember is origin, not as blessing, but as engineering, not as cosmic purpose, but as practical necessity, not as children of the divine, but as solution to a problem, born from rebellion, designed to serve, carrying within us the mixed essence of earth and something else, something the tablets call divine, but which function more like genetics, more like biological essence, more like the physical component transferred when one god was slaughtered so his ghost could mix with clay and make us aware. The assembly in Nippur. The city held no political power. Nippur never served as dynastic capital, never raised armies for conquest, never accumulated wealth through trade monopolies, yet every Mesopotamian ruler from every period considered control of Nippur essential to legitimate kingship. Kings who conquered Babylon or Ur or Uruk could claim those cities' resources and strategic positions, but kings who controlled Nippur could claim something more fundamental, recognition by the divine assembly, because Nippur wasn't built for human purposes. Nippur was built as the meeting place of the Anunnaki. The Eker temple, the mountain house, dominated the city's sacred precinct. Excavations revealed a structure of massive scale, rebuilt and expanded across millennia, but always maintaining its core function. The temple's inner chamber was called the Dur-An-Ki, the bond of heaven and earth, identified as the location where decisions affecting both realms were made. This wasn't metaphorical sacred space. The texts treat it as functional administrative headquarters, the place where the governing council met to issue decrees that humans were required to follow. The temple hymns attributed to Enheduanna describe Nippur's Eker in administrative rather than devotional language. House which knows no darkness, house which is the bond of heaven and earth, house founded by An, praised by Enlil. In Nippur, the Anunnaki determine the fates. The verb used, tar, means to cut, to determine, to decree. It's judicial and administrative language, the same terminology used when describing human courts rendering judgments. The Anunnaki don't mystically influence fate, they functionally decree it through decisions rendered in assembly. The texts identify a specific subset of the Anunnaki who hold supreme authority, the Seven, who decree fates. Different sources list slight variations, but the core group remains consistent: An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nanna, Utu, and Inanna. These 7 sit in judgment, deliberate on matters brought before them, and issue binding decrees. The structure parallels supreme courts in human governance, small councils with ultimate judicial authority whose decisions establish precedent and law. An holds the highest theoretical authority as original progenitor, but he's largely removed from direct governance by the time of most texts. He remains in heaven, representing ultimate sovereignty, but delegating actual administration to his son Enlil. This pattern supreme authority held by one who doesn't exercise direct control, with executive function transferred to an active administrator, appears in later Mesopotamian kingship and in governance structures across cultures, as if the model came first and human institutions copied it. Enlil functions as executive administrator, the one who enforces decisions, who maintains order, who directly supervises operations on Earth. The texts consistently portray him as strict, demanding, quick to punish violations of decreed order. He's the disciplinarian among the 7, the enforcer whose authority derives from An, but whose actions shape day-to-day existence. When humans become too numerous or too noisy, Enlil initiates population control measures. When the Ijiji rebel, Enlil convenes the emergency council. When Ziusudra survives the flood against orders, Enlil rages before accepting the fait accompli. He's not abstract divine authority, he's active administrator dealing with ongoing problems. Enki serves as counselor and innovator, the one who solves problems through cleverness rather than force. Where Enlil decrees and enforces, Enki negotiates and engineers. He proposes creating humans to solve the labor shortage. He warns Ziusudra about the coming flood, despite Enlil's decree that all humans must die. He mediates disputes between other Anunnaki and finds compromises that maintain order without resorting to punishment. If the council functions like government, Enki fills the role of chief advisor, the one whose expertise makes him valuable even when his methods conflict with executive decisions. Ninhursag, also called Ninma, Nintu, Mummy, holds authority over life and birth. But this isn't fertility goddess symbolism, it's functional jurisdiction. She possesses the knowledge and skill to create viable life, to manipulate biological processes, to engineer outcomes in organisms. When humans need to be created, Enlil and An consult with Enki, but Enki must collaborate with Ninhursag because she has specialized expertise he lacks. The text treats her authority as competency-based, not as natural force personified. She can do things others can't, giving her a specific role in the governance structure. The younger members of the 7 Nanna, moon god, Utu sun god, and Inanna, Venus morning star, hold astronomical associations that might be more literal than symbolic. If the Anunnaki possess technology for space travel or function on cosmic scales, then those associated with specific celestial bodies might have jurisdictions related to those locations or orbital patterns. Nanna oversees timekeeping and calendar regulation. Utu oversees justice and sees everything under the sun. Inanna's association with Venus, the wandering star, matches her role as the volatile, unpredictable member of the council. These could be metaphorical domains, or they could reflect actual areas of responsibility in a system that operated across a wider spatial scale than Earth's surface. An, God lists, systematic catalogues of the Mesopotamian pantheon compiled and maintained across centuries, organized deities in hierarchical relationships. The lists function like organizational charts, showing reporting structures, jurisdictional divisions, and ranked authorities. The Anunnaki appear as a defined group within the larger divine assembly, distinguished from the Ijiji, who function as lower-ranking workers or servants, and from independent major deities who don't participate in the council system. What's striking is the consistency of this organization across cultures and time periods. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts maintain the same basic structure even as specific names and details shift. The 7-member Supreme Council, remains constant. The assembly at Nippur remains central. The hierarchical relationships stay stable. This suggests the organizational system itself was considered factual, something that couldn't be arbitrarily modified because it documented actual structure rather than invented theology. Administrative texts from Ur-3 period, Drehem, reveal another layer. These tablets, numbering over 15,000 from the site of Pusrish Dagan, record daily offerings to Anunnaki by name, with specific quantities delivered to specific temples on specific dates. The records span years of continuous accounting, tracking livestock, grain, beer, bread, textiles, and other material goods allocated to divine recipients. The tone is purely bureaucratic. No prayers, no hymns, no religious language, just line-item accounting of resources distributed according to regular schedules. Why maintain such records for mythological beings? Why track deliveries to entities that don't exist physically? The simplest explanation is that someone at those temples was receiving the deliveries. Whether the Anunnaki themselves, or priests acting on their behalf, or administrators managing the temple systems doesn't ultimately matter. The accounting treats them as real recipients of material goods at locatable addresses. You don't budget provisions for abstractions. You budget for entities that require sustenance or compensation or tribute. The procedural language extends to descriptions of council meetings. Texts describe the Anunnaki gathering in the Ekur, taking their seats in assembly, hearing cases brought before them, deliberating, and issuing decrees. The verb forms are active and specific. They sit down, chew, they speak, dug, they deliberate, hadgigi, they decree, tar. This is the language of actual meetings, not symbolic representations of cosmic principles. The grammar describes beings performing actions in a location, following procedures, producing outcomes. The Atrahasis epic describes one such council meeting in detail. When the Igigi rebel, Enlil summons the assembly. They gather. Enlil presents the problem. The workers have rebelled and refuse to continue labor. An asks questions. Who incited this? Shall we fight them? The assembly deliberates on options. Enki proposes the solution: create replacement workers. The council debates this proposal. Finally, they reach consensus. Proceed with human creation. The meeting follows recognizable parliamentary procedure: problem presentation, deliberation, proposal, debate, decision. What we're seeing documented might be actual governance structure. If the Anunnaki were real, in some form administrators of a civilization or project that predated human civilization, then these texts preserve organizational charts and procedural records from their system. The 7-member Supreme Council makes administrative sense, small enough for efficient decision-making, large enough for diverse perspective. The assembly structure allows participation by larger groups while reserving ultimate authority for the core leadership. The jurisdictional divisions assign clear responsibilities while maintaining coordinated function. Nippur's role as permanent sacred neutral ground also makes administrative sense. If you're organizing multiple city-states under a unified system, you need a location that no single state controls, where leaders can meet on neutral territory to make collective decisions. Nippur served exactly that function. It held no military power, accumulated no dynastic authority, but maintained sacred status that gave it immunity from conquest. The city existed as meeting place, as record-keeping center, as neutral ground where the assembly could function without being dominated by any single power center. The pattern appears in later human governance. The United Nations sits in neutral New York rather than in any single member nation's capital. The European Parliament meets in Brussels, a deliberately chosen neutral location. Throughout history, federations and alliances have established neutral sacred spaces where collective decisions get made without any member dominating. If humans learned governance from observing Anunnaki administration, they'd naturally replicate this pattern, and they did, with Nippur as the template. The texts never explain why the Anunnaki needed assembly governance. They simply describe it as the system that existed, but the need for governance structures implies limits on individual authority. If the Anunnaki were omnipotent gods, they wouldn't need councils and voting and procedural meetings. they'd simply will outcomes into existence. But if they were powerful beings with advanced capabilities who nonetheless operated under constraints, who needed to coordinate actions and resolve disputes and make collective decisions about shared projects, then assembly governance makes perfect sense. The seven who decree fates aren't personifications of natural forces. They're administrators who make binding decisions. The assembly at Nippur isn't metaphorical sacred space. It's functional meeting place where actual deliberations produced actual decrees that affected actual populations. The organizational charts in god lists aren't theological symbolism. They're documentation of who reported to whom, who held which jurisdictions, who made which kinds of decisions. This interpretation doesn't require the Anunnaki to be extraterrestrial specifically. It simply requires them to be real beings with real organizational structures governing real projects during the period before the flood, when the king list says they ruled as kings. Whether they were advanced humans, survivors of an earlier civilization, visitors from elsewhere, or something else entirely, the texts describe their governance system in consistent, detailed, procedural language that reads as documentation rather than invention. The alternative is that Sumerians invented elaborate administrative theology that just happens to parallel how actual large-scale organizations function, that they created procedural descriptions of meetings that never occurred between beings who never existed, and that they maintained this fictional governance structure with such consistency across cultures and centuries that later peoples couldn't tell it was invented. Possible, but it requires explaining why they'd invest so much effort in realistic procedural detail for purely imaginary systems. The simpler explanation is that they were documenting something real. The assembly met in Nippur. The seven who decree fates made decisions there. The larger Anunnaki Council participated in deliberations. Administrative records track the resources allocated to support this system, and humans who observed this governance structure, either directly during the Anunnaki period or through preserved records after the flood, built their own systems by copying what they'd seen work. The bond of heaven and earth, the place where fates were decreed, the neutral sacred space where the council met to govern. Nippur remembers its function. The Eka stands in ruins, but the texts preserve what happened there, and what happened was administration, governance, the practical work of organizing civilization under a system where ultimate authority rested with a small council who met regularly to make binding decisions affecting all operations under their jurisdiction. Not gods in the theological sense. Administrators in the practical sense, beings with names, jurisdictions, personalities, conflicts, and procedural methods for resolving disputes and making collective decisions. The assembly in Nippur wasn't where humans went to pray, it was where Anunnaki went to govern, and the humans who eventually inherited that governance structure remembered where they learned it, preserved the organizational charts in god lists, and maintained Nippur as sacred because it had once functioned as something real, headquarters of the system that ruled before the flood. During those 1,200 years when kingship had descended from heaven and the Anunnaki walked as administrators of cities built for purposes the tablets still remember, the deluge and what survived. 3 separate tablets, written centuries apart, copied from sources even older, tell the same story with different names and details that shift in the retelling, but never deviate from the core narrative. The Anunnaki decided to destroy humanity through flood. One among them opposed that decision. A human was warned and survived. The world after was different from the world before. The flood marked the boundary, the event that divides history into antediluvian and post-diluvian, the catastrophe that ended one era and began another, the Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 10673 combined with CBS 1087 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, is fragmentary, about 2/3 lost to time and damage. What survives begins mid-narrative, with cities already established, kingship already descended from heaven, humans already multiplying across the land. The text describes the Anunnaki growing disturbed. The land became wide. the people became numerous. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their clamour and said to the great gods, "The clamour of mankind has become burdensome to me. I am losing sleep because of their noise." This isn't divine wrath over sin. This is administrator frustrated by noise pollution. The problem is practical. Too many humans, too much noise, the situation exceeding intended parameters. Enlil proposes solution: reduce the population, first through plague, then through drought and famine. But Enki repeatedly intervenes, teaching humans how to counteract each measure. When plague comes, Enki shows them medicine. When drought threatens, Enki teaches them irrigation techniques to conserve water. Enlil's population control measures fail because another Anunnaki keeps providing humans with countermeasures. Finally, Enlil convenes the full council and proposes ultimate solution: flood, complete destruction, reset the system by eliminating the problem population. The council agrees, except Enki. The text is damaged here, but what remains shows Enki warning Ziusudra, despite the council's decree, "Pay attention to my words. A flood will sweep over to destroy the seed of mankind." This is the decision, the decree of the assembly of the gods. Enki's warning is indirect, speaking to a wall rather than directly to Ziusudra, a technical compliance with the council decree that forbade warning humans while still communicating the message. He tells Ziusudra to tear down his house, build a boat, abandon possessions, save life. The instructions are practical, specific: dimensions for the vessel, construction materials, waterproofing techniques. This isn't vague divine guidance. This is technical manual for boat construction, detailed enough that someone following the instructions could build an actual vessel. The Atrahasis epic, preserved primarily on British Museum tablets, BM 78941 and BM 78943, provides more detail. The flood section describes not just Atrahasis receiving warning, but the Anunnaki's own reaction to the catastrophe they initiated. When the flood comes, the gods, who remain in heaven watching, react with unexpected emotion. The Anunnaki wept with her. The gods were sitting, weeping. Their lips were parched with thirst. 7 days and 7 nights the flood swept over the land. This detail is striking. The Anunnaki who decreed the flood then weep while watching it unfold. Ninhursag particularly laments, "How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods? How could I order battle to destroy my people? I myself gave birth to man. Now, like fish spawn, they fill the sea." The regret is immediate and profound. Whatever decision logic led to the flood decree, witnessing the actual destruction causes some Anunnaki to question whether the solution was justified. The duration appears consistently across versions, 7 days and 7 nights. This specific time frame suggests actual historical event rather than mythological construct. Myths tend toward symbolic numbers, 40 days in the biblical version, or vague, long-time descriptions. 7 days is specific enough to be remembered by survivors, standard enough across versions to indicate shared source material. When the waters recede, Atrahasis offers sacrifice. The text describes the Anunnaki smelling the offering and gathering around it like flies. There, depleted, the sacrifice-burned meat producing aromatic smoke attracts them immediately. This detail suggests the Anunnaki are physical beings who require sustenance, not abstract spirits. Enlil arrives last and rages when he discovers a human survived. Where did this come from? No man was to survive the destruction. But Enki admits his intervention, argues with Enlil about the justice of total destruction, and proposes alternative population control measures, natural limits on fertility, child mortality, celibate priestesses, demons that snatch infants. Harsh measures, but not species extinction. The Gilgamesh Tablet XI version, catalogue number K, 3375 at the British Museum, tells the story from Utnapishtim's perspective. He was warned by Ea, Akkadian name for Enki, built the boat following precise specifications, loaded it with seed of all living things, survived the flood with his family and the animals he'd preserved. After the waters subsided, he released birds to test for dry land. First a dove, then a swallow, finally a raven that didn't return, indicating land was habitable again. This detail about sequential bird releases appears to be practical survival technique, the kind of knowledge someone who actually experienced this would remember and pass down. When Utnapishtim makes landfall on Mount Nimush, he offers sacrifice. The gods gather to it, Ishtar. Inanna swears by her lapis lazuli necklace that she'll never forget this catastrophe. I shall remember these days and never forget. Let the gods come to the offering, but let not Enlil come, for he brought on the deluge without consideration and handed my people over to destruction. Even among the Anunnaki, Enlil's decision is controversial. Not all agreed with the solution. Not all believed the outcome justified the means. The most interesting moment comes when Enlil finally arrives and sees the boat. Initially furious that humans survived, he's eventually persuaded by Ea's argument, "How could you, unreasoning, bring on the deluge? On the sinner impose his sin, on the transgressor impose his transgression. Yet be lenient, lest he be cut off. Be patient, lest he be dislodged." This is plea for proportional response, for justice rather than annihilation, and it works. Enlil boards the boat, takes Utnapishtim and his wife, blesses them, and grants them immortality. Formerly Utnapishtim was a human being, but now he and his wife shall become like us gods. Utnapishtim shall reside far away at the mouth of the rivers. This transformation, human elevated to divine status, appears only in the Gilgamesh version, but it's significant. It suggests the boundary between human and Anunnaki isn't absolute. Humans can become like them. The difference is status and knowledge, not unbridgeable species divide. Utnapishtim's immortality comes as compensation for surviving what he wasn't supposed to survive, a reward for being chosen to preserve what needed preservation. What all three versions agree on: the flood was deliberate, decided by council, opposed by at least one Anunnaki, survived by one family, warned in advance, followed by regret and reconsideration of the decision. This isn't natural disaster, mythologized into divine punishment. This is description of intentional action, internal disagreement, and post-action assessment of whether the right choice was made. The archaeological record shows evidence of catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia, though not a single global event. Different sites show flood layers at different depths and dates, suggesting multiple regional floods rather than one synchronized catastrophe. But collective memory could have conflated these separate events into one paradigmatic flood that symbolically represented the transition from the antediluvian world to the historical period. Geological research indicates the Black Sea experienced catastrophic flooding around 500–600 BCE, when Mediterranean waters breached natural barriers, flooding vast areas and creating the sea we know today. This event would have displaced populations, destroyed settlements, and lived in cultural memory as apocalyptic deluge. Whether this is the flood remembered in Mesopotamian traditions remains debated, but the timeline places it before Sumerian urban civilization, during the Ubaid period when the cultural foundations for later cities were being established. What matters for the timeline is the function the flood serves in Sumerian chronology. It marks the end of direct Anunnaki rule and the beginning of human dynasties operating under divine guidance. Pre-flood, the king list records Anunnaki ruling as kings with impossibly long reigns. Post-flood, human kings with human lifespans. The transition is abrupt and total. Something changed at the flood boundary, something significant enough that civilization had to be rebuilt, knowledge had to be relearned or recovered, and the relationship between Anunnaki and humans shifted from direct governance to distant supervision. The preservation motif appears in all versions. Enki Ea specifically tells the survivor to save not just life, but the knowledge needed to rebuild civilization. In some versions, this includes written records, tablets containing the accumulated wisdom of the antediluvian age. The flood destroys infrastructure and population, but if knowledge survives, either in preserved texts or in the memory of survivors, civilization can be restored rather than reinvented. This explains the pattern we see archaeologically. Sophisticated techniques appearing immediately after destruction layers, urban planning that doesn't show experimental phases, technologies that seem to emerge fully formed, not because humans suddenly became smarter after the flood, but because they were rebuilding using preserved knowledge from before. The instructions of Shuruppak frame themselves this way: wisdom from the last pre-flood king to the first post-flood survivor, knowledge transmitted across the catastrophe boundary specifically, so it wouldn't be lost. What did the flood destroy? According to the texts, cities, populations, infrastructure. What survived? According to the texts, one family, the knowledge they carried, the animals and seeds needed to repopulate. What changed? According to the texts, the Anunnaki withdrew from direct rule, established new parameters for human population and reproduction, and transitioned to a system where humans governed themselves under divine oversight rather than divine direct control. The flood becomes the mechanism that explains continuity and change simultaneously. Continuity, civilization after the flood, resembles civilization before because it's reconstructed using preserved knowledge. Change, the rulers, change from Anunnaki kings to human kings. The timeline shifts from extended reigns to normal human lifespans. The relationship between divine and human realms becomes more distant. Could this all be mythology, explaining the transition from prehistoric to historic periods? Certainly, every culture needs narratives that explain major transitions, that account for discontinuities in the archaeological record, that justify current social structures by grounding them in ancient precedent. The flood story serves all these functions effectively, but the consistency across independent sources suggests something more than invented mythology. The Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hebrew versions differ in details, but agree on core narrative, intentional destruction, divine disagreement, human survival through warning, preserved knowledge, and post-catastrophe rebuilding. Either this is remarkably coordinated mythological invention, or it's distorted memory of actual events that different cultures preserve through their own narrative frameworks. The tablets don't prove a global flood occurred. They don't prove the Anunnaki were real beings who made the decision to destroy humanity, but they do preserve consistent testimony across multiple independent sources about a catastrophic event that divided history, that required rebuilding from preserved knowledge, and that marked the transition from one kind of world to another. Ziusudra survives in the Sumerian version. Atrahasis survives in the Akkadian Atrahasis. Epic. Utnapishtim survives in the Gilgamesh account. Noah survives in the Hebrew Bible. Manu survives in the Sanskrit Matsya Purana. Deucalion survives in the Greek flood myth. Nu survives in Hawaiian tradition. The names change, the details vary, but the core narrative persists. One family warned by divine figure, builds vessel, survives catastrophic flood, repopulates the world, preserves the knowledge needed to rebuild. Either humans worldwide independently invented the same narrative structure, or they're preserving fragmented memory of actual events experienced by ancestral populations before their dispersal. The former requires explaining why this particular narrative rather than infinite other possibilities. The latter requires accepting that something approximating the flood accounts actually happened, even if the details have been distorted through transmission. The tablets preserve the memory. The flood swept over. The world before was destroyed. The world after was rebuilt. And what survived the transition, preserved in boat, carried in memory, written on tablets saved from destruction, was the knowledge that allowed civilization to continue, diminished but not extinguished, transformed but recognizable, carrying forward from the antediluvian age into the historical period when humans ruled cities. The Anunnaki had designed and maintained systems the Anunnaki had established. The deluge came, but not everything drowned. Some knowledge survived, some memory endured. And in the texts that preserve that memory, we find not just flood story, but explanation for the timeline that divides at the catastrophe 200 and 400 years before, measured in ways we don't understand, under rulers who weren't human. Then 7 days of destruction. Then human history beginning again, built on foundations that predated the flood, guided by knowledge that survived it, remembering a world that was lost but not entirely forgotten. The tablets remember. The flood is documented. And what it documents is transition, violent, catastrophic, transformative, from the age when Anunnaki walked as kings to the age when humans inherited their cities and tried to maintain what had been given, carrying forward the timeline that started before the flood and continues after, diminished but unbroken, connecting us to origins we've learned to call mythology, because the alternative requires reconsidering everything we think we know about when civilization began and who built its foundations. After the waters receded, the king list resumes with formulaic precision. After the flood swept over and kingship descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish. The text acknowledges discontinuity. Kingship had to descend again, had to be re-established, but it treats the resumption as natural continuation of the same system. The authority comes from the same source. The institution follows the same structure. What changed is who sits on the throne and how long they reign. In Kish, Gal became king and ruled for 1,200 years. Gullah-Nidaba, Anapad, ruled for 960 years. Palakinatim ruled for 900 years. The numbers have dropped dramatically from the antediluvian section. We're no longer dealing with tens of thousands of years, but they're still far beyond normal human lifespans. The first post-flood dynasty still measures reigns in centuries, not decades. The transition from Anunnaki to human timescales isn't immediate. It's gradual, a stepping down through intermediate figures who bridge the gap between the antediluvian age and recognizable historical chronology. As the king list progresses through successive dynasties, Kish, Uruk, Ur-Awan, Kish again, Hamazi, Uruk again, the reign lengths continue to decrease. By the time we reach the first dynasty of Ur, around 2600 BCE, reigns measure in decades. Mes-Anpada ruled for 80 years. His son Meskiag, Nana, ruled for 36 years. These are still extraordinary by modern standards, but they're approaching the range of recorded human experience. Extremely long lives, but not impossible ones. By the time we reach Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 BCE, we're firmly in historical territory. Sargon ruled for 56 years, according to the king list. And this number can be cross-referenced with other sources, with archaeological evidence, with synchronisms that allow dating verification. We've transitioned from mythological inflation or impossible chronology, depending on how you interpret the antediluvian section, to documented history that fits within frameworks we understand. The progression is clear. Pre-flood kings ruling for multiples of 3,600 years, immediate post-flood kings ruling for centuries, intermediate dynasties ruling for decades verging on centuries, historical kings ruling for recognizably human lifespans. This suggests the antediluvian chronology isn't arbitrary mythological inflation. If the goal was simply to make ancient kings seem impressive, why have this gradual stepping down? Why not jump directly from impossible reigns to normal reigns? The gradual decrease suggests the numbers mean something, represent something real, even if we don't understand the measurement system. What happened after the flood that would produce this pattern? If we take the texts seriously as documentation, the Anunnaki withdrew from direct rule but didn't disappear entirely. They established human kings to govern the rebuilt cities, but those early human kings still had direct contact with Anunnaki advisors, still received guidance and authorization from divine assembly. The first post-flood rulers might have been hybrids, part human, part Anunnaki, or humans who'd received life extension through Anunnaki technology or biology. Their extraordinarily long reigns reflect this intermediate status, no longer Anunnaki ruling directly, not yet purely human rulers either. As generations passed, the Anunnaki presence diminished. Direct contact became less frequent. The intermediary rulers gave way to fully human dynasties. The authorization system shifted from direct divine appointment to hereditary succession justified through ancient precedent. By the time we reach historical kings like Sargon, the Anunnaki have receded into mythology, their direct role replaced by theological justifications that maintain the form of divine kingship while acknowledging the gods no longer walk among humans as they once did. The tablets document this transition through institutional continuity and changing relationships. Post-flood cities are built on or near antediluvian sites. The temple systems continue. The administrative structures are maintained, but the residents of those temples shift from Anunnaki to their statues, from direct divine presence to representations serving as focal points for religious practice. The offerings continue. 3 administrative tablets still allocate provisions to Anunnaki by name, but whether anyone receives those offerings directly is unclear. The system persists through institutional momentum even as its original participants withdraw. The flood itself might have been less total than the texts suggest. If the catastrophe was regional rather than global, some cities or settlements outside the flood zone could have survived, preserving populations, knowledge, and infrastructure. The tablets focus on Mesopotamian cities that were destroyed and rebuilt, but that doesn't preclude survivor populations elsewhere contributing to post-flood recovery. The Sumerian king list admits that kingship descended from heaven again after the flood, suggesting re-establishment rather than pure continuity, but that re-establishment could have involved survivors regrouping, recovering what knowledge they retained, and rebuilding according to remembered or partially preserved patterns. Archaeological evidence shows destruction layers at sites like Uruk, and Shuruppak, around 2800 BCE, followed by rebuilding phases. The rebuilding shows continuity with what came before. Same architectural principles, same urban planning concepts, same technological capabilities, but the scale is reduced initially. The immediate post-flood period shows smaller settlements, less monumental architecture, population decline, then gradual recovery. Populations increase, buildings become more elaborate, trade networks re-establish, administration becomes more sophisticated. By the early dynastic 3 period, around 2600 BCE, Mesopotamian civilization has fully recovered and is approaching the complexity levels seen before the flood layer. This pattern matches what you'd expect from catastrophic regional flooding: massive destruction, population loss, knowledge disruption, followed by recovery using whatever was preserved. The recovery isn't starting from zero. Survivors carry knowledge. Some written records are saved. The physical landscape still bears marks of earlier infrastructure. Rebuilding proceeds faster than initial development because the knowledge already exists. It just needs to be re-implemented. The transfer of kingship between cities post-flood also follows patterns established in the antediluvian section. Kingship moves from Kish to Uruk to Ur to Awan, just as it moved from Eridu to Bad to Bira to Larag to Zimbir to Shuruppak before the flood. The system of rotating capitals, of kingship as transferable authority that moves between cities according to divine decree or political military success, continues unbroken. The flood disrupts the system but doesn't destroy it. After the catastrophe, the same institutional structures resume operation. What's most striking is what doesn't change. The cities rebuilt on the same sites, the temples dedicated to the same deities, the administrative systems following the same principles, the writing system continuing to develop from pre-flood origins, the agricultural techniques maintaining the same sophistication, the legal concepts preserving the same categories. Everything that made Sumerian civilization distinctive continues after the flood, suggesting the knowledge base survived intact or nearly so. This is why the preservation motif in flood accounts matters. Enki tells Ziusudra to save not just life, but the records, the tablets, the accumulated knowledge. Whether this happened literally, actual clay tablets preserved in the boat, or metaphorically, knowledge preserved in survivors' memories, the result is the same. Post-flood civilization has access to pre-flood knowledge. They're not rediscovering irrigation or inventing writing or figuring out how to build temples. They're applying knowledge they already possess, knowledge given by Anunnaki before the flood and preserved through the catastrophe. The instructions of Shuruppak embody this continuity, written as advice from the last antediluvian king to his son who survives the flood. The text assumes sophisticated social organization, legal systems, property rights, professional specializations, all the complexities of urban civilization. These things don't need to be explained or justified because they're already established. What needs to be preserved across the catastrophe is how to maintain them, how to apply them, how to keep civilization functioning using principles developed before. The timeline after the flood tracks the gradual humanization of kingship. The first post-flood rulers in Kish have reigned too long to be fully human. They're transitional figures, possibly literally half Anunnaki through parentage, possibly recipients of life extension technology, possibly beneficiaries of biological enhancements that the Anunnaki could provide, but which became less available as Anunnaki withdrew. Their reigns measure in centuries because they're still operating partially in Anunnaki time, still maintaining direct contact with divine authorities who authorize their rule. As those authorities become more distant, as the Anunnaki transition from active governance to passive oversight, the rulers become more human, their reigns shorten. Their authority derives more from hereditary succession and military success than from direct divine appointment. By the Akkadian period, kingship is fully humanized. Kings still claim divine favor, still legitimize their rule through theological justification, but the gods they invoke are distant, approached through ritual and prayer rather than direct consultation. The Anunnaki haven't disappeared from the timeline. They remain present in theology, in ritual, in the persistent belief that ultimate authority comes from divine sources. But their function has changed. They no longer walk as kings. They no longer gather in assembly at Nippur to make binding decrees affecting human civilization. They've become what we recognize as gods in the theological sense, powerful, distant, deserving worship and sacrifice, but no longer physically present administering cities and making daily decisions about human affairs. This transition from direct governance to distant authority explains the timeline structure. The 241,200 years before the flood represent Anunnaki direct rule. The gradually decreasing reigns after the flood represent the transition period as Anunnaki withdraw and humans take over. The historical dynasties represent fully human rule justified through theological claims about divine authorization, but operating without direct Anunnaki involvement. If this interpretation is accurate, the flood marks not just physical catastrophe, but administrative transition. The disaster provided reason or excuse for the Anunnaki to change their governance model. Maybe the populations had become unmanageable. Maybe the experiment of creating human workers had succeeded beyond parameters and no longer needed direct supervision. Maybe internal Anunnaki politics demanded withdrawal. Maybe the catastrophe itself was so devastating that rebuilding under the old model wasn't practical. Whatever the cause, the tablets document the result. After the waters receded, the world was different. The cities were rebuilt, but those who'd ruled them directly were gone. Humans inherited the system, but not the rulers. The knowledge survived, but the teachers withdrew. And kingship, which had descended from heaven before the flood, descended again after, but this time into human hands, to be maintained by human effort, guided by distant divine authorities, who no longer walked among their subjects, but watched from temples and heavens, receiving offerings, hearing prayers, issuing occasional guidance, but no longer administering the daily operations of civilization they'd established when the first cities were built and the first cities were built, and the first kings ruled for periods measured in numbers we call impossible. The king list continues past the flood without breaking format because the system continues. What changes is the scale, the participants, and the timeline. But the structure remains. Kingship comes from divine authority, transfers between cities, maintains continuity through documented succession. The flood disrupts but doesn't destroy, and after the waters recede, humanity rebuilds using knowledge preserved from before, maintaining systems established by those who came from the sky, carrying forward a civilization that began when kingship descended and continued after the catastrophe that was supposed to destroy it, but instead transformed it into something that could endure without its creators walking among its citizens. The tablets track this transformation. The reigns decrease, the rulers humanize, and the timeline after the flood becomes recognizable history, emerging from catastrophe, built on foundations older than the flood, preserving memories of rulers who came before, when gods were kings and kings reigned for periods that stretched beyond human comprehension into an age. The tablets insist was real, even if we've learned to call it mythology. 3. Interpretations of the timeline. The evidence sits on tables in climate-controlled rooms. WB 444 in Oxford, CBS 10673 in Philadelphia, K 3375 in London. Thousands of tablets across dozens of institutions, all contributing pieces to the same chronological puzzle. 8 kings, 241,200 years. Cities that appeared with sophistication already developed. Creation accounts that read like procedures. Administrative records tracking provisions for beings called Anunnaki. Flood narratives describing deliberate destruction and intentional preservation. And after the catastrophe, gradually decreasing reigns as human kings inherited a system established by someone else. The question isn't whether this evidence exists. It's unquestionably there. Documented, verified, accessible to anyone who wants to examine it. The question is what this evidence means. And there are 3 primary ways to interpret it, each with strengths, weaknesses, and implications that extend far beyond Bronze Age Mesopotamia. Interpretation 1. Pure mythology. This is the standard academic position. The antediluvian section of the king list is mythological prologue, symbolic rather than historical. The impossibly long reigns serve to establish kingship's antiquity and divine origin without making literal chronological claims. The numbers are multiples of 3,600 because that's a significant number in Sumerian mathematics, 60 square, a complete cycle, not because they measure actual duration. The Anunnaki are theological constructs, personified natural forces, deifications of cosmic principles, or simply the Sumerian pantheon doing what pantheons do, explaining origins, legitimizing social structures, providing narrative coherence to cultural identity. This interpretation treats the creation accounts as mythology, explaining human origins through stories acceptable to Bronze Age mentality. The labor rebellion isn't historical. Its narrative device explaining why humans must work. The flood is either mythologized memory of local flooding or pure literary invention serving theological purposes. The transition from divine to human rulers represents ideological shift from theocracy to monarchy, expressed through narrative about God's withdrawing rather than describing actual events. The strength of this interpretation is it requires no extraordinary claims. Humans invent myths. Myths serve social functions. Ancient cultures regularly attributed their achievements to divine sources because that's what pre-scientific peoples did. The Sumerian material fits patterns recognizable from mythology worldwide. Nothing in the tablets demands non-mythological explanation. The weaknesses are equally clear. This interpretation must explain why Sumerian mythology uses documentary format rather than poetic structure, why the numbers show mathematical precision if they're arbitrary, symbolic inflation, why administrative texts allocate provisions to mythological beings using the same accounting systems applied to verifiable economic activities, and why so many independent sources agree on core details if they're inventing rather than preserving. It must also explain the archaeological problems, why cities appear with sophistication already present, why writing emerges in developed form, why technologies lack visible experimental phases. The standard answers: rapid development, cultural diffusion, gaps in archaeological record work individually, but strain when applied comprehensively. Each anomaly has explanation, but the cumulative pattern suggests something more than gradual evolution. Interpretation 2. Encoded wisdom. This reading treats the texts as sophisticated allegory, encoding philosophical, astronomical, or spiritual knowledge in narrative form. The 241,200 years might represent astronomical cycles, precessional periods, planetary conjunctions, or cosmic ages that Sumerian astronomers tracked and embedded in their king lists. The Anunnaki might be stellar or planetary deity, their descent from heaven describing celestial movements, their reigns measuring sidereal time rather than terrestrial years. In this framework, the creation accounts aren't literal biology, but spiritual teaching about human nature, with mixture of earth, material, mortal, and divine essence, consciousness, spirit, created to serve higher purposes while trapped in physical form. The rebellion and flood represent cyclical destruction and renewal, the eternal pattern of cosmic ages ending and beginning. The gradually decreasing rains track humanity's spiritual devolution, our fall from semi-divine origins into purely material existence. This interpretation is popular in esoteric traditions and alternative archaeology. It treats ancient cultures as philosophically sophisticated, capable of encoding complex knowledge in symbolic narratives that preserve information across generations. The strength is it takes the text seriously while avoiding literal interpretation that conflicts with modern chronology. The tablets mean something real, just not what surface reading suggests. The weaknesses mirror those of pure mythology interpretation, but add new problems. Why encode knowledge this way instead of stating it directly? Sumerians had technical and astronomical texts that presented information straightforwardly. Why hide advanced knowledge in king lists and creation myths? And if the encoding is intentional, where's the key? How do we know we're decoding correctly rather than finding patterns that aren't actually there? This interpretation also struggles with procedural details. If human creation is metaphor for spiritual development, why include specific instructions about clay, blood, gestation periods, and birth goddesses? Metaphors can be simpler. The granular detail suggests the texts intend literal description, not symbolic encoding, unless the detail itself encodes information. But then interpretation becomes arbitrary. Anything can mean anything if we assume sufficient layers of symbolism. Interpretation 3. Historical documentation. This reading takes the texts at face value as attempting to document actual events using language and concepts available to their authors. The Anunnaki were real, not gods in theological sense, but advanced beings, possibly from earlier human civilization, possibly non-human, who possessed sophisticated knowledge and capabilities. They established cities in Mesopotamia, ruled them directly during the antediluvian period, created humans through biological engineering as labor force, governed through administrative council, and withdrew after a catastrophic flood that ended their direct governance period. The impossibly long reigns record actual duration using a measurement system we don't understand, possibly orbital cycles, possibly different timekeeping, possibly life extension technology that made antediluvian rulers genuinely longer lived. The creation accounts describe genetic engineering using terminology Bronze Age scribes had available: clay for biological material, divine blood for genetic contribution, gestation in birth goddesses for surrogate development. The administrative records track provisions for beings who were physically present or whose representatives required material sustenance. The flood was deliberate population control but got out of hand, leading to near total destruction. But knowledge was preserved, allowing post-flood civilization to rebuild using antediluvian principles. The gradually decreasing rains track transition from Anunnaki, direct rule, through hybrid intermediaries to fully human dynasties. Everything in the tablets documents real events, even if the language is imprecise and some details have been distorted through transmission. The strength of this interpretation is it explains anomalies that other interpretations struggle with: sudden appearance of sophisticated civilization, procedural language in creation accounts, administrative precision in religious texts, global flood traditions, archaeological discontinuities coinciding with flood layers. It treats Sumerians as accurate historians documenting their knowledge of events rather than as primitive peoples who couldn't distinguish myth from reality. The weaknesses are obvious. It requires accepting that the Anunnaki were real, that advanced civilization existed before currently accepted chronology, that biological engineering occurred in deep antiquity, and that standard historical and archaeological frameworks are fundamentally wrong about civilization's origins. These are extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence, and while the tablets provide evidence, interpreting them as historical documentation requires assumptions mainstream scholarship isn't prepared to make. This interpretation also inherits problems from conspiracy thinking. If the Anunnaki were real, why don't we have physical remains, artifacts, technology? Where did they go? Why did they withdraw? And why do orthodox academics ignore or suppress this evidence? The answers tend towards speculation about hidden archaeology, suppressed findings, or academic conspiracy, none of which strengthen the interpretation's credibility. Comparative evaluation. All three interpretations must account for the same evidence: tablets that exist, numbers that are recorded, cities that were built, knowledge that appeared, chronologies that are preserved. Each interpretation emphasizes different aspects while minimizing others. Pure mythology emphasizes cultural patterns and social functions while minimizing the precision, procedural detail, and documentary format of the source material. Encoded wisdom emphasizes symbolic sophistication while minimizing the straightforwardness of much of the language. Historical documentation emphasizes literal reading while minimizing the extraordinary nature of what's being claimed and the lack of corroborating physical evidence. Is there middle ground? Perhaps the texts preserve distorted memory of actual events, but the events weren't as extraordinary as literal reading suggests. Maybe an advanced human civilization existed before Sumerian period, was destroyed by regional catastrophe, and survivors preserved knowledge that later cultures attributed to divine sources. The Anunnaki might have been this earlier culture's elite, advanced in knowledge and technology relative to their contemporaries, but still human, still mortal, their achievements magnified through transmission until they became gods in later tellings. This hybrid interpretation allows for historical kernel without requiring non-human beings or impossible chronologies. It explains knowledge transfer, survivors teaching descendants, sudden sophistication, rebuilding using preserved knowledge, and divine attribution. Later, cultures not understanding where the knowledge came from. It maintains the tablet's documentary function while acknowledging distortion through transmission and theological reinterpretation. But even this moderate position requires accepting that mainstream chronology is significantly wrong about civilization's timeline, that advanced cultures existed and were destroyed before Sumerian period, and that academics have either missed or ignored evidence of these predecessors. That's still controversial, still challenges orthodox frameworks, still requires revising timelines we've built carefully through decades of archaeological work. What the tablets say, whatever interpretation we prefer, the tablets themselves are clear about what they claim. They claim kingship descended from heaven. They claim Anunnaki ruled for 200 years before the flood. They claim humans were created deliberately as workers. They claim knowledge came from divine sources. They claim catastrophe destroyed the antediluvian world. They claim civilization rebuilt using preserved knowledge. They claim the system that ruled before the flood established the patterns that human civilizations followed after. Modern interpretation tries to fit these claims into frameworks we're comfortable with, but the Sumerians weren't writing for us. They were writing for themselves and their immediate audiences, recording what they believed happened, preserving chronologies they considered authoritative, documenting systems they observed or inherited. Whether we call it mythology, encoded wisdom, or historical documentation, they treated it as their history, their origins, their explanation for why things are as they are. The three interpretations aren't mutually exclusive in absolute terms. Elements of truth might exist in each. Maybe the texts are mythological in form, but preserve historical kernel. Maybe they encode knowledge while also documenting events. Maybe they're historical documentation that became theology as the documented events receded into past, and living memory was replaced by tradition. Or maybe one interpretation is correct, and the others are elaborate attempts to avoid its implications. Maybe the texts are pure mythology, and we're seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe they're encoded wisdom, and we lack the key to decode properly. Maybe they're historical documentation, and everything we think we know about civilization's origins is wrong. The evidence can't settle the question definitively. The tablets exist, the numbers are recorded, the chronology is preserved. What it all means depends on assumptions we bring to interpretation, on what we're willing to consider possible, on how much weight we give to source material versus modern frameworks. What we can say with certainty: the Sumerians recorded a timeline that doesn't fit our chronology. They preserved numbers that don't make sense in our measurement systems. They documented events we call mythological, but which they treated as historical. And they did so with precision, consistency, and care across centuries of transmission, suggesting they believed what they recorded mattered, that preserving it accurately was important, that future generations needed to know about the 200 and 400 years when Anunnaki ruled before the flood. Three interpretations. Same evidence. Different conclusions. The question isn't which interpretation is proven, none are, definitively. The question is which interpretation best accounts for all the evidence while making the fewest extraordinary assumptions. And that question each person must answer for themselves, weighing the tablets against their own understanding of what's possible, what's plausible, and what the past might hold that we've forgotten or never knew. The timeline. They don't teach. The Ashmolean Museum closes at 5. By 6, the galleries are empty. The case is darkened. The staff gone home. WB444 sits in its climate-controlled case, alone in the darkness, just clay and cuneiform and 40 centuries of preserved chronology. No one reads it now. No one debates its meaning. It simply exists, patient as stone, waiting for morning when visitors will come again to look at it, photograph it, read the placard that calls it a king list from ancient Sumer, approximately 2000 BCE, recording mythological and historical rulers. The placard doesn't mention the 200 years, doesn't explain why 8 antediluvian kings ruled for periods that mainstream chronology calls impossible, doesn't address the transition at the flood, the gradually decreasing reigns, the shift from divine to human rulers. It calls the pre-flood section mythological and moves on to dynasties that can be verified archaeologically. The uncomfortable numbers are acknowledged and dismissed, labelled legend, explained away as symbolic inflation serving ideological purposes. This is the timeline they teach in history class. Civilization begins in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE when writing appears at Uruk. Cities developed from agricultural villages. Culture evolves gradually. Sumerians invent cuneiform, mathematics, law codes, and astronomy through normal human innovation over centuries. Religion involves gods they invented to explain nature and legitimize authority. The king lists antediluvian section is mythology, interesting as literature and cultural artifact, but not as history. The Anunnaki never existed except as theological constructs. The flood is either vague memory of local flooding or pure literary invention. This timeline is clean, linear, comfortable. It fits frameworks built through archaeological methodology and evolutionary models of cultural development. It requires no extraordinary explanations, no revision of fundamental assumptions about human capability and chronology. It's the timeline that textbooks present, that museums explain, that academic consensus accepts as closest approximation to truth we can achieve given available evidence. But it's not the timeline the Sumerians recorded. They recorded something different, something that doesn't fit the clean narrative, something that includes rulers who came from the sky, reigns measured in impossible numbers, cities built according to predetermined functions, knowledge given rather than discovered, and a catastrophe that divided history into before and after, ending an age when gods walked as kings. That timeline, the one actually written on tablets, preserved across millennia, copied faithfully by scribes who maintained the numbers exactly, isn't taught in history class. Not because it's hidden or suppressed, but because it's unexplainable within accepted frameworks. So it's acknowledged and reinterpreted, translated into comfortable categories that don't threaten orthodox chronology. It becomes mythology, symbolism, theological poetry that primitive peoples couldn't distinguish from fact. But what if the Sumerians weren't primitive? What if they understood the difference between myth and record, poetry and documentation, theology and history? They kept separate categories of texts. They used different formats for different purposes. They demonstrated mathematical and astronomical sophistication that required precise observation and calculation. Yet we assume that when they recorded their chronology, they abandoned precision for symbolic inflation, that they mixed legend with history indiscriminately, that they couldn't tell the difference between factual record and mythological embellishment. That assumption, that ancient peoples were intellectually inferior to us, that they lacked critical thinking, that their records are unreliable unless they align with our chronology, might be the most extraordinary claim of all. More extraordinary than accepting the Anunnaki might have been real. More extraordinary than considering the pre-flood numbers might mean something. More extraordinary than entertaining the possibility that civilization's origins are older and stranger than we've been taught. The tablets sit in museums. The numbers remain unchanged, and they preserve a timeline that tells a different story than the one in textbooks. A story where kinship descended from heaven, where beings called Anunnaki ruled for periods measured in multiples of 3,600, where cities appeared with purposes assigned, not purposes evolved, where humans were created deliberately, taught intentionally, integrated into a system that predated their existence, where catastrophe destroyed that system but didn't erase it, allowing civilization to rebuild using preserved knowledge from an earlier age. That story might be mythology, it might be encoded wisdom, or it might be historical documentation of events we no longer recognize as possible because they don't fit our timeline, our chronology, our comfortable narrative about civilization emerging from primitive beginnings through gradual evolutionary progress. The question isn't whether we can prove definitively which interpretation is correct. We can't. The question is whether we're willing to take seriously what the tablets actually say before deciding they must mean something else. Whether we're willing to consider that the people who invented writing might have used it to write accurately, that the people who developed mathematics might have recorded numbers precisely, that the people who built the first cities might have known who built them and why. The timeline they don't teach isn't hidden in secret archives or suppressed by academic conspiracy. It's sitting in museums, catalogued and accessible, written in cuneiform that's been translated, preserved on tablets that anyone can examine. It's not taught because teaching it requires explaining why it's wrong, and the explanations, symbolic inflation, mythological charter, theological poetry, require assuming ancient peoples couldn't distinguish between different categories of information, or teaching it requires accepting it might be accurate, which threatens frameworks built over centuries of scholarship, which demands revising chronologies that entire fields of study depend upon, which opens questions about who we are, where we came from, and whether the past holds chapters we've forgotten or never knew existed. The prism sits in its case. Morning comes, visitors arrive, they look at the ancient clay, read the placard, take photographs. Most move on quickly. It's just another artifact, interesting but not transformative. A few linger, reading the columns, counting the years, doing the arithmetic that produces 200 and 400 and wondering what that number means, what those ancient scribes thought they were recording when they added up the reigns of 8 kings who ruled before the flood. Those who linger long enough might start to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions about whether the numbers mean something, whether the precision indicates actual measurement, whether the Anunnaki might have been real, whether the cities appeared sophisticated because they were designed that way, whether the knowledge came from outside because someone from outside brought it, whether the flood marked an actual transition from one age to another, whether the timeline recorded on this clay prism preserves history. We've learned to call mythology because accepting it as history would require reconsidering everything we think we know, but most don't linger that long. They read the placard's explanation, mythological rulers, symbolic numbers, interesting cultural artifact, and move on to the next display. The timeline they've been taught remains intact. The comfortable chronology holds, and the numbers that don't fit are explained away as products of primitive minds who couldn't distinguish between reality and fantasy. The clay doesn't argue, it simply preserves what was written. 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years. Then the flood. Then human history, beginning, rebuilt on foundations from before, carrying forward a system established by those who came from the sky when kingship descended, and cities were built, and humans were created to maintain what the Anunnaki had designed. That's the timeline they don't teach. Not because it's suppressed, because it's inexplicable within accepted frameworks, because accepting it requires admitting we might be wrong about fundamental assumptions, because the alternative, that ancient peoples knew their own history better than we do, that their records preserve truth we've reinterpreted as falsehood, threatens the entire edifice of modern chronology. So the timeline sits in museums, acknowledged and dismissed, preserved and explained away, and those who look at it must choose. Do we trust our frameworks or their records? Do we believe our chronology or their numbers? Do we assume they were confused or consider we might be? The tablets offer no proof, only testimony. They tell us what the Sumerians believed about their origins, their rulers, their timeline. Whether we accept that testimony depends on what we're willing to consider possible, on whether we think ancient peoples were primitive and confused, or sophisticated and accurate, on whether we trust that gradual evolution explains everything we see, or entertain the possibility that something else, something stranger, older, more deliberate, might have been involved in civilization's founding. The prism waits, the numbers persist, and the timeline they preserve keeps not quite fitting the history we've written, keeps suggesting there might be chapters we've missed, keeps offering an alternative chronology where gods were kings, and kings reigned for periods that stretch beyond human comprehension into an age before the flood, when the world was young and those who built it walked among the cities they'd designed, teaching humans to maintain systems they'd established, governing from temples that still stand in ruins, remembered in tablets that preserve their names and numbers and the impossible timeline of their rule. That timeline isn't taught in history class, but it's there in the tablets, waiting, preserved, unchanged after 40 centuries, still saying what it always said, still claiming what it always claimed, still recording the 200 years when Anunnaki ruled before the flood, before the waters swept over, before kingship descended again to humans who inherited cities they didn't build, and knowledge they didn't discover, and a civilization that began not with them but with others, with those who came from heaven and walked as kings, and left behind a timeline that doesn't fit our chronology, but which they carefully preserved as if they believed future generations needed to know that before our history began, there was another history longer and stranger, ruled by beings we've learned to call gods because we've forgotten what the Anunnaki actually were. The museum closes. The gallery darkens. The prism sits in silence, alone with its numbers, waiting for someone to take them seriously, to read them as more than mythology, to consider that the people who wrote them might have known what they were writing and why it mattered, and that the timeline they recorded might be exactly what it claims to be. A chronology of our origins, preserved across the flood, carried forward from an age when gods walked as kings and kingship had descended from heaven to cities built for purposes we've forgotten, but which the tablets still remember. That's the timeline they don't teach, but it's the timeline the tablets preserve. And somewhere between what we're taught and what was written lies a question we haven't fully answered. Whose version of the past is more accurate? The chronology we've built through modern methodology, or the chronology they recorded when the events were closer, when the memories were fresher, when the distance between their present and that impossibly ancient past was shorter than the distance between us and them. The tablets can't force an answer. They can only present their testimony. 8 kings, 5 cities, 200 and 400 years. Then the flood. Then everything changed. Then the age when gods were kings ended and the age when humans inherited their system began. That's what the tablets say. That's the timeline they preserve. That's the chronology they don't teach in history class. But it's there, in the clay, in the cuneiform, in museums around the world, waiting to be read not as what we think it must mean, but as what it actually says. Waiting for someone to take seriously the possibility that the Sumerians knew their own history. Waiting for us to consider that the timeline they recorded might be the timeline that's real, even if it doesn't fit the history we've written. The prism waits. The numbers remain. And the question sits between them and us. Whose version of the past do we trust? The one they recorded, or the one we decided they must have meant? That question has no easy answer, but it's worth asking, worth considering, worth holding in mind the next time someone confidently explains that the Anunnaki were just mythology, that the 241,200 years are just symbolic inflation, that the Sumerians couldn't tell the difference between reality and fantasy. Maybe they couldn't, or maybe they could. And maybe the timeline they don't teach in history class is the timeline that's real, preserved by people who knew what they were recording, maintained by scribes who copied it faithfully, waiting in museums for us to read it, not as mythology we've learned to dismiss, but as history we've forgotten how to recognize. The tablets remember. The question is whether we're ready to remember with them.